Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on sort of apprenticeships 101 really. So today's presentations are going to be delivered by Rachel Roby. Rachel is Strategic Apprenticeship Lead at Cogent Skills and sort of handles sort of all our day-to-day queries, inquiries and strategic relationships with government with regards to apprenticeships. Just some housekeeping rules before we go into the webinar. So the lines are on mute and sort of webcams are off as well. The session's been recorded and a copy of that recording will be made available afterwards. There's a chat box in the bottom of the screens. If you've got any questions for Rachel as we're going through the presentation, then please fire them through. We've got some time for Q&A at the end. If there's any sort of questions at the end, we can go through those. And any unanswered questions we'll pick up offline as well. So yeah, without further ado, I'll hand you over to Rachel to take you through today's apprenticeship webinar. Thanks, Rachel.
Hi everybody, yes, thank you for joining me this Wednesday lunchtime. I'm Rachel Roby, the Strategic Apprenticeship Lead here at Cogent Skills, and today I'm going to be talking to you about a general introduction to apprenticeships. So this is all about a kind of supporting you with your understanding of the current apprenticeship landscape based and focused on England, and during the session we'll look at kind of an introduction to apprenticeships, understanding what is on offer and where to find what's on offer, touch on funding and how the funding works, and then a section on the apprenticeship journey and the stakeholders that are involved. So as an introduction, so first of all, as a general introduction, so what is an apprenticeship? So a definition of an apprenticeship is a programme of learning which must last a minimum of 12 months that combines hands-on opportunities to train and obtain qualifications whilst working and working in a paid position, and 20% of your time must be set aside for learning, which usually takes place through a college, university or training provider. The rest of the time is spent at work in your role, applying the knowledge and skills that you are learning to do the job that you are set out to do. At the end of it, you'll gain a official certification, which will be equivalent to more traditional qualifications. And there's just a table at the bottom, which when we talk about apprenticeships, we do talk about levels, and we talk about levels from 2 to 7. So a level 2, level 3 would be your entry point, so intermediate and advanced, and they equate to GCSEs and A-levels. And then we class levels 4, 5, 6 and 7 as higher apprenticeships, which are obviously at HNC, HND, and then degree level. And then we also have degree apprenticeships, which are level 6 and 7. The difference between a higher and a degree apprenticeship is that there will be a bachelor's or a master's degree included in the programme. So moving on to apprenticeships. So I'm sure you've heard of apprenticeships. I hope you've heard of apprenticeships, but apprenticeships have been around for a very long time. They have been around for decades and they have gone through various different connotations throughout the years. Traditionally, apprenticeships worked on a 4-year cycle, and they were designed to include an MVQ, which was a portfolio of evidence that was gathered, and that focused on the knowledge and the performance criteria, so what you were learning to do and how you're putting that learning into practice. And you would gather evidence during your training time and put that into an MVQ. It would be assessed against units, and if you met those criteria, you would pass those units. You would also sit a number of exams, normally multiple choice exams, but various different connotations that would cover a technical certificate. And this was purely focusing on the knowledge at the level and in the subject that you were on your apprenticeship for. And then you would have elements of English, maths and ICT, which again have gone through changes. It used to be called key skills, they've been essential skills, and more recently transition to functional skills. Now, since 2013, there has been a transition into what we now call apprenticeship standards, and I'll talk about why those changes came in a moment. But since 2013, some key changes came into practice. And what happens now in terms of how apprenticeships are developed, how they are delivered, how they are assessed, is all designed through employer-led trailblazer groups. So groups of employers that come together and set out exactly what should be covered in an apprenticeship through the design of something called an occupational standard, which outlines exactly what the knowledge, skills and behaviours of that individual at that level should be able to demonstrate. There are some rules around, again, it being a minimum 12-month programme. There should be mandatory maths and English, and we'll cover that later. And at the end, there is an independent endpoint assessment. So in the old world, when a portfolio of evidence was gathered and assessed as the programme was delivered, what happens now is everything is assessed at the end. So the learner goes through their learning journey. At the end, a decision is made as to whether or not that learner is competent, and then they go through what we call the gateway, and they go into endpoint assessment, and they are assessed by an independent person that has had nothing to do with the training programme and can independently assess at the level and in the role that the learner is working towards. In terms of the design, and I won't spend too much time on this, but if this is something that you want to know more about, please obviously get in touch and we can do a more detailed session on kind of how apprenticeships are designed. But overarching, an apprenticeship is made up of an occupational standard, and this includes a detailed list of the duties, which is the typical daily activities that somebody in the role would do, along with a set of knowledge statements, which will be the key learnings that somebody has to be able to know, the key skills that somebody should be able to show and do, and then the key behaviours, which is how the learner should live. So this is about their attitude, their behaviours and their outlook in the role. Within an endpoint assessment plan, there are a series of requirements that are included within this. And the endpoint assessment plan looks at how the learner will be assessed at the end of the programme. So you'll have some key requirements that have to be met, whether that be a qualification that's undertaken, a timescale of how long the training should be, if there are any minimum levels that need to be met, whether they need to submit anything as part of the endpoint assessment. We then have a detailed list and outline of how and by what method the learner will be assessed. And then we have some key responsibilities of who is involved in the process. And then the most important part is a big mapping matrix, which will show how each knowledge, skill and behaviour that has been designed in the occupational standard will then be assessed, and a grading criteria of how that learner will be graded. And it's a detailed piece of work that is then used by the training providers and the endpoint assessment organisations, who are the independent people that assess, will use that to develop all of their materials to teach the learner everything they need to know, show, live, and also for the EPAO, which is the endpoint assessment organisation, to know what they're testing against and how they're going to go and carry out that endpoint assessment. In terms of what is out there, the Institute of Apprenticeships and Technical Education is a arm's length body independent of the Department of Education. It was set up as part of the changes that came in 2013, and they put all of the apprenticeships that have been designed into occupational routes. And there are 15 on the screen that I won't read through, but every standard that is designed must fit into one of these routes. And when I talk you through the next few slides, you'll see how you can search through the route. You can, there's various different mechanisms within the Institute's website that can support you in understanding where to find apprenticeships and what they're found. But they are all broken down into these 15 occupational routes. In terms of what is out there, so I've added the link and we'll share that link with you. On the Institute of Apprenticeships, you have something that's called a set of occupational maps. It's very easy to find when you go onto the website, and this will outline exactly what is available to you and what apprenticeships have been designed. And just as an example, I have screenshot the current science pathway occupational map. And what this shows you is a list of all of those standards that have been designed at level 2 and level 3, which is your technical occupations, your higher level, which is your level 4s and 5s, and then your professional occupations, which is your level 6 and 7. And what you can do is you can have a look in a list form. All of these are hyperlinked, so if you did hover over the name of animal technologist, you would be able to go on to that page and see the standard in detail. You'll see there's some little keys. If it's something that's got a tick, it means that there is an apprenticeship that's live for it. If there is a light bulb, it means it's either being proposed or it's going through change. And if there's a little spanner by it, it means that there is active work going through, which is part of a cycle of every 3 to 4 years. Each standard that's live will go through some form of revision, and they'll be looked at. But this is your, I suppose, your one-stop shop to find out what is actually out there. There are over 650 standards. These have been developed since 2012. So we're in our 11th year of designing apprenticeship standards, hence the numbers. They are easy to read once you know what you're looking for and where you're going to find what you're looking for, but you have various different mechanisms that you can search through these occupational maps. Also on the home page of the Institute, as soon as you log on, you can find a search bar where you can type in a job role, and that will also support helping find, or you can go through these occupational pathways and have a look at the 15 different routes and what is available to use. When you've found a standard, so again, I'm using an example of a level 6 laboratory scientist, which is a popular degree apprenticeship programme. You will see that you come to the home page of that standard, and on that you have an outline, a very brief overview, so a 1 to 2 line definition of what the role is, along with underneath an occupational profile, which gives you about 4 or 5 paragraphs of information which tells you where the job is found or where the occupation is found, what the typical day in the life of is, who they work with. And then it also talks you through what typical job titles would be encompassing in that occupational profile and any entry requirements to start that apprenticeship programme. So obviously with a level 6, which is a degree level, there may be, and there is often, some minimum requirements and minimum entry levels that a learner would need before they would embark on that apprenticeship standard. As you carry on scrolling, you then come to a set of knowledge, skill and behaviour statements. So what you would do is you would scroll down underneath the occupational profile. You would then come up with a list basically of knowledge statements, of skill statements and behaviour statements. And this is your first point of call when you'll start to look at what is available to you and what the type of content a learner would be learning and a learner would be tested on. And that is outlaid in a big long list, depending on how big the standard is, and will give you that information you need to understand what the learner would be learning. Further down, you will then come to some information that you will have some access to hyperlinks. So there's a hyperlink there that will take you to a separate document which would outline what the assessment plan is, which would give you an idea of how the learner is going to be assessed at the end. This would also include what qualifications they would work towards, how the EPA would work, how the grading would work and what grading the learner could come out with, and would also give you the information about the timescales, who's involved and the key responsibilities. You also have a hyperlink there called Find Apprenticeship Training Providers. This will take you to an external site which will show all of the current providers that have currently been approved to deliver the standard that you're looking at. Within that page, you can search by postcode, you can search by what your preferred delivery option would be. So whether you would like the learner to go to college to have their learning, or whether or not you would like the training provider to do things remotely and come to you. You can use the search functions to support you tailoring the search that you want. So if you know that your potential apprentice or your future learners might not be able to drive and you need them to go to a provider that's close by, you could put a 10-mile radius in as an example. And then also one of the other things that's worth knowing, you cannot, an apprenticeship cannot go live until an endpoint assessment organisation has been confirmed for it, and through the Find an Endpoint Assessment Organisation hyperlink, you would find who is currently delivering the endpoint assessment. And by knowing that, you can maybe go onto their website, do a little bit of research about what they offer and what information they can give to support you as an employer, but also information on how that apprenticeship would be delivered. So there's just some practical tips on what to find. What I would recommend is that you use the link, go onto the Institute's website and have a play around, really use the search function, have a look on the occupational maps and just start to get a feel of what is actually available to you and the types of apprenticeships that are currently out there. Moving on to the next section, which is around apprenticeship funding. So how does funding work for apprenticeships in England? So in 2017, the government introduced an apprenticeship levy. This was introduced and is applicable for companies who have a payroll of over £3 million a year, and anything over that 3 million, 0.5% is moved into an electronic account. This account is purely for the use of apprenticeship training in England, and it will support you to be able to pay for the training and the costs for the training provider and the endpoint assessment organisation. The money is kept for 2 years. It's taken on a rolling monthly basis, and you have 2 years to use the money that's in the account. It is now all digital, so there is a digital account. If you don't have a digital account as a company, or you're not sure if you do, one thing I would recommend is to speak to your finance team. They will be the ones that are probably managing the payments of the levy, and they should have access to the account. If not, there is a hyperlink. There is a link below that you can paste, and that is how you can set up a digital account. You will need some payroll information to set that up, so it might be something that you need to do with payroll or HR, but it is something that can be set up if you don't already have an account. And what I would say is there are regular incentive campaigns for employers who take apprentices on. So there are regular schemes where if you take a 16 to 18-year-old, then there are financial incentives involved, and it is something to keep an eye on, that there can be additional funds available to you. Another thing that I would say is if you have a levy pot that you aren't currently using, either because apprenticeships aren't part of your current models of training, or it's something that you haven't explored yet, which I would highly recommend exploring more, there is a levy transfer programme. So those companies that may have a surplus of funds that you know you're not going to use, you can transfer up to 25% annually to other companies that can use levy funds. There's lots of initiatives out there, and again, if you would like some more information on levy transfer, either for you to support levy transfer of another company, or if you've run out of levy and want to potentially be supported, there are companies out there that actively engage with levy transfer, and it's something I'd highly recommend. If you aren't a levy payer, and there's many companies that aren't, there is a scenario where you would be funded 95% of any of the costs. So 95% will be funded, and you would be asked to pay a 5% contribution. In the last few years, so anybody maybe from a non-levy payer who's been involved in apprenticeships previously, the training provider may have sorted out all of the funding on your behalf. What's happened now is all non-levy payers again have access to a digital account. you would register and you would request a maximum of 10 apprentices a year. That is what your current limits are, that you would be able to get funding for up to 10 apprentices. Once that had been approved, you will then make the normal connections with a training provider, and the 95% of the funding would be paid for, and you would be asked to commercially contribute 5%. When I say 5%, that ESFA and the funding body behind the apprenticeship levy will fund up to 100% of what the funding allocation has been applied for on the apprenticeship standard. So there's a maximum funding of £27,000. There is a minimum funding of 1,000 or 1,500. So apprenticeship training and apprenticeship funding band fall in between that funding rate. If your programme costs more money than the maximum that the government have said that they will give, you would be asked to contribute over and above the 5%. So if the funding comes out at the maximum funding cap, that will be paid for. You will be asked to pay 5%. If the training provider charges additional fees that you agree to, you will have to pay that on top of your 5% contribution. In terms of funding, once you get into the realms of agreeing and working with a provider, there is a set of funding rules that you as an employer will agree to. The majority of the funding rules are more applicable to the training provider because it's the guidance that they are given on how they are to run their training provisions. But there is a set of funding rules that all learners that are on an apprenticeship programme sign up to, and as their employer, you are responsible for ensuring that the funding rules are being met. The big rule and the most important rule is the 20% off the job, which means that 20% of their contracted hours are agreed to be spent on their learning experience. So 20%, equivalent of a day a week, would be spent on their apprenticeship programme, and that is a fundamental rule that must be adhered to and must be met throughout the programme. And it's one of the, what I've mentioned before, gateway requirements. It's one of the requirements that is needed before a learner can go through and undertake their endpoint assessment. Off-the-job training is when an apprentice does dedicate their time. This can either be through attending college for a day, having some online learning sessions, doing some independent study. So they might be spending the day researching, writing an assignment, going on a course, shadowing somebody and learning some new skills. But it's something that they wouldn't be doing in their normal day-to-day activity, and it's activity that is developing their knowledge, skills and behaviours towards the apprenticeship standard that they're enrolled on. Within the funding rules, there is a big long set of rules, and again, if you want more information on funding rules, I can do a whole other session on that. But what I would say is you have a range of eligible costs and ineligible costs. And what I would say is if it is your first time looking and engaging with apprenticeships, it's really important that you have discussions with your training provider and that you understand what is costed and what is funded, and that a training provider is upfront with you and shows potentially what isn't eligible and what additional costs may be required. On the whole, and I will say on the whole, the majority of things that are needed for a learner to be able to learn what they're learning and be able to have the skills, develop the skills and develop the behaviours are included in the training costs. What things might not be included is if a learner needs to go off to university campus for a week to do some lab work or do some intensive training, the accommodation and subsistence costs would not be included in the funding rule. So there's an example of something that wouldn't be an eligible cost and something that you would have to support the apprentice with and pay for. But in terms of them attending college, what they're learning, the skills assessments and such like, they would be included in eligible costs. Okay, I'm going to move on to the, I suppose, the most important section really, and this is about the apprenticeship journey and the key stakeholders that are engaged or should be engaged throughout the process. So I've put a little visual together. This shows you the journey of an apprenticeship program. So once you have an apprentice, and what I would say is apprenticeships can be for anybody. So whether or not you are recruiting new talent into the business in the form of apprentices, and you are taking somebody who is at the beginning of a journey, beginning of a role and isn't competent, or whether you have an existing member of staff who wants to progress upwards, wants to cement their knowledge, wants to develop their role more, and as part of succession planning, you have had those conversations, that is also eligible for an apprenticeship. And it's really important that you're looking at new talent, but also supporting your existing talent. And apprenticeships are a really good way of supporting that existing talent pipeline and that succession planning pipeline for the future leaders or future managers of the business. And how that starts is they start with a sign-up process, which leads through an initial assessment, which gathers where their initial starting point is, and a training plan would be devised. There needs to be a minimum of 12 months worth of learning that a learner has, but if the learner has already, or the apprentice has already got some prior knowledge, this would be taken into account. And one of the rules is that you don't overteach, or you don't teach the person the same thing twice. So in that regard, you would the learner would be what we call fast-tracked through that that section of learning, or they wouldn't be funded for certain sessions because they already have the prior knowledge. Once everything has been agreed, the contracts have been signed, the training plan has been agreed, all your responsibilities, and the learner knows theirs and the provider knows theirs, you then go into your on-programme learning. Obviously, this can range from 12 months to 5 years. Some programmes are 60 months in length. And you go through your learning and development, your on-the-job training, and your 20% minimum off-the-job training. You would go through a series, you'll follow the training plan, and you would have regular check-ins, which I'll talk about in a bit more detail. The learner would go through their learning. They would either go to college, university, have their learning delivered. Assessment visits would take place, coursework would happen, independent study would take place, and all the way they are building evidence to support the knowledge, skills and behaviours that they are learning in the role. At the end of the programme, a decision will be made as to whether or not that learner is competent. And if everybody agrees, the learner would go through the gateway and they would go into their endpoint assessment, which again, I mentioned at the beginning, are a set of formal assessments that the learner would sit and be tested on what they have learned through the programme. And then I won't go through this in full detail, but this just kind of breaks down exactly what each stage includes. Again, I have mentioned much of this already. What I would say is really important is around that sign up and induction. Obviously, you will make contact with a training provider to discuss what apprenticeship program you want. You need to make sure that the training provider is the right provider for you and the right provider for the learner. Is it going to suit the learner's learning need? So the way that they deliver the program, is that going to suit the learning style of the learner? And when designing the training plan, is it a realistic training plan? Does it meet your business needs? Does it cover everything that you feel that you need that learner to be able to know, to show, to live? What I would say is training providers need to individualise learning plans. Every apprentice, whether or not you have 3 apprentices on the same programme, or whether you have 10 apprentices on the same programme, each learner should be given an individual learning plan. Everybody's starting points will be different and everybody's experience should be individualised. But what I would say is that initial induction and that training plan development shouldn't be underestimated as a big piece of work, because it is, but it should be right, and you should be patient with that, because a good training plan set out really, really clearly, everybody knowing their expectations, will help and support a really good apprenticeship programme moving forward. Whilst the learner is on programme, obviously there should be regular check-ins. There is an auditable requirement that a training provider carries out a review with the learner maximum of every 12 weeks. But obviously there should be monthly engagement with a learner, and there should be activity taking place every month so that the learner stays engaged. Obviously they're spending 80% of the time with you as the employer, so it's important that you are supporting them, you're supporting them with their college work, you're supporting them with their skills development, the role that they're doing, is that fulfilling what the learner needs to be able to do? Are you engaging with the regular check-ins and making sure that the learner is progressing the way that they should be to meet the knowledge, skills and behaviours and to meet the timeline within the training plan? But also they're being supported, they're getting everything that they need, either from you as an employer or the training provider independently. And then, as I say, Gateway is that kind of final decision as to whether or not the learner is competent. You shouldn't be having those conversations lightly, but it also shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody if competence hasn't been met. If you're engaging regularly in the 12-week reviews and you're seeing the progress that your learner is making, you should then be able to move through those Gateway discussions. If things are, bearing in mind that apprentices, we're all real people, and things can happen, especially if you're undertaking a program that might be 3 to 5 years long. It's a long time in an individual's life to commit to something. So there may be good years, there may be bad years, roles that develop. So what I would say is, as an employer, so as a bit of a tip for you, is to understand that the learner might be progressing in their role and they might be then responsible for more things. They might be getting internal promotions, but they do still have their apprenticeship commitments. And it can become difficult for apprentices as they become more competent. They're becoming a more valued member of your team, and they're instrumental in certain departments, that people can, not on purpose, but forget that they are still apprentices and they do have that 20% requirements. They have deadlines for assignment work, they might need exam support, etc. So it's important that they are still supported, as well as being, pushed to succeed and progress in their role. There's a couple of slides here on the support and what you should be expecting. So this focuses on the training provider. So what should a training provider be doing? Again, I could talk all day about what providers should be doing, but fundamentally there's a few examples here with the minimum requirements, I would call them. What I would say is all providers have subtle differences, and that could be how they deliver, their timetabling, how they plan to communicate. But fundamentally, they are responsible for designing that delivery plan and making sure it happens, supporting you as an employer with all of the onboarding, all of the cost models and the training plan models. They are responsible for supporting the programme all the way through. So when the learner starts their learning journey up until the end, they should be supporting all of the delivery content and making sure that the learner is staying on track, that they have everything that they need, that they're providing feedback, that they're obviously engaging in the delivery, that they're supporting the learner, but also supporting them on a wider range. So functional skills, if the learners don't have the level of English and maths that they need as part of the Gateway requirements, they will be funded to support their maths and English. Also personal development. There is a range of other topics that could and should be included, budgeting, safeguarding, responsibilities, leadership and management skills, communication skills, all that kind of wider ranging content that can be included in an apprenticeship is the responsibility of that training provider to ensure it happens. They should be able to provide you and the learner with a named contact, and they are responsible for safeguarding. So although your apprentices may be over 18, they may will be adults, there is still safeguarding responsibilities of any training provider that takes on an apprentice, no matter what age. If your learner is potentially 16 to 18, there are additional safeguarding regulations in place. that the training provider will be responsible for. They will have oversight of kind of a health and safety audit of your workplace. They will talk to you about what safeguards you have. You know, are you working in a high hazard environment, and what risk assessments are in place for your apprentices? But fundamentally, they have a responsibility to keep that learner safe. And then in terms of you as an employer, so again, I can totally understand if this is something that you've never embarked on before, that it can be kind of a daunting process. What I would say is a good provider will support you with all of this. And I think it's really important that you form a relationship with providers, and good relationships with providers. Fundamentally, where your responsibilities lie, you are their employer, whether or not you are their official employer or whether or not you are their host employer. So some companies have headcount restrictions and therefore like to use apprenticeships through apprenticeship training agencies. Now, this is an option to explore if you do have restrictions on your headcount, that you could look at employing or recruiting an apprentice, but they would be employed officially through an apprenticeship training agency, and that would support, they would support with a lot of these processes. But fundamentally, you would host them, you would be responsible for them, you'd be with them for 80% of their learning, and you would be facilitating the job role that they're learning. So through that, there is obviously all of the recruitment, making sure you're employing the right person, supporting the apprentice, as I've said, to make sure that they can meet the training plan, that they can hit all the knowledge, skill and behaviour statements. Allowing the training provider to engage, so making sure that they're allowed to come into site to carry out assessments. If the learner is falling behind and they need to do some additional learning, ensuring that is facilitated, engaging with the 12-week reviews and making sure that you're providing feedback on how you feel the learning experience is going, and engaging with targets that are being set. Support all that off-the-job learning activity. So if learners do have, a college day or they have exams that they need to prepare for, making sure that is built into, their working week. Timetabling, if there's key projects and key deadlines at work, making sure that is all fed into the training provider. Obviously, training providers will have a timetable that they would like to keep to, but they also understand that there may be some times in the year where it's going to be really difficult for you to either let your apprentice out or off-site. I know in retail, as an example, they have blackout areas. So, and in food production, they also have blackout. So as an example, the kind of month of December is pretty much a washout for retail apprentices to come off the job. And all of these discussions can happen when you're developing your training plan to make sure that the programme will work for all parties. What I would say is, obviously, you have that responsibility. You are building the relationship and the learner is with you, majority of the time of their programme. So it's really important that you're comfortable with what you're signing up for, you fully understand what the learner is going to be learning, and that you are staying engaged so that they can stay on track and succeed in their apprenticeship programme. Before I finish and hand over for any questions, there is a wealth of information out there. I have included some links just as an initial, I suppose, one-stop shop for where to find some certain things. What I would say, I suppose, to close, before I do go for questions, obviously I've gone through a lot of detail in a short space of time, tried to cover where you can find what apprenticeships are out there, key stages of the apprenticeship journey, how you can obviously fund and pay for the training. But obviously we're here to support if there is specific questions that you have. If you are dipping your toe into the water for the first time, or if you're looking at maybe expanding, you may have 1 or 2 apprenticeship programs at the moment, but you're looking at expanding, there is support out there. There is a lot of guidance out there. The key links that I've included are probably my most common ones that I use on a kind of daily, weekly basis. A bit of a tip, I probably wouldn't start to read the funding rules as they're about 300 pages long, but it is something that is important once you gain some confidence and once you get into apprenticeships and start to have more apprentices and start to potentially challenge what providers are saying or how they're interpreting rules, that it would be something important to start to understand. But fundamentally, working with a really good provider, getting some good relationships, and starting off positively. One thing that I will say, there was a recent change in this year's set of funding rules that puts more emphasis on the training provider supporting your recruitment. So if you're struggling thinking about how you're going to recruit apprentices, there is a national recruitment service. There is a website that advertises all apprenticeship vacancies, or they can, and a training provider will be able to support you with that. So if you have existing staff that you think you would like to put them on an apprenticeship, my top tip would be to have a conversation about what potential apprenticeship would be suitable for them, and then start to look at providers that are already delivering that apprenticeship programme. If you are thinking that you might want to bring somebody on into an apprenticeship and what you kind of looking at where to get started, I would look at working with a training provider to support you, and they can help you with your advertising, your recruitment, and then they can talk you through the process. And that's that. That is your whistle-stop tour of Apprenticeships 101.
Thanks.
Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks, Rachel. Cheers for that. Just a reminder, if you've got any questions, you've still got time to pop them through. There's just a couple of questions that have come through, Rachel, and it's around apprenticeships for existing staff. So rather than new people into the business, this is for apprenticeships for existing staff. Just any sort of different processes or anything different that people need to be aware of about that.
Yeah, of course. So as I mentioned just towards the end, apprenticeships can be used for anybody. Remember that golden rule of 12 months worth of learning that they need. So it would ideally be for somebody that is looking to progress and looking to potentially move into a new role in the future, and you have deemed that they need some training to be able to progress upwards, then apprenticeship would be a really good route to look at that. What I would recommend is, if it isn't something that is already happening as part of your performance reviews or how you do your annual appraisals, is that you start to have conversations with people about progression opportunities. If you are already using commercially paid for training, that there may be an apprenticeship equivalent that you would like to explore, then that would be an option. But yes, apprenticeships can be used for everybody, as long as they can justify the minimum 12 months worth of learning that they would need to embark on.
Excellent, thanks. And another question, Rachel, just on this one is around a training provider. So any assessment criteria, what should people look out for if they're embarking on this journey and want to identify a training provider for their own business?
Yeah, of course. So in terms of training providers, what I would personally look for is a track record. So do they have experience on delivering the standard? I suppose the first point of call would be doing some research on their website. Do they have information on the standard? Do they have any testimonials on there? It doesn't necessarily have to be a glossy brochure, but can you see that they are actively marketing that standard? I would then start to look at, if you are going to talk to them and you are interested in the programme that they're delivering, are they upfront? Do they have statistics on their current numbers? And do they have any achievement rates or success rates that they can show you? Are people passing? Are people staying on the programme? And also be cheeky, ask, will they put you in touch with any of their current employers? Will they put you in touch with any of their current apprentices? Could you have a chat with somebody that currently is on the apprenticeship or uses that apprenticeship programme? Good providers will have what I would call a gold list of employers that will be there, will be supportive and help providers market the courses. If it was me, I would have what to set up a 15-minute call with a potential employer that would be interested in using the standard to share experience. Not to say that a provider isn't good if they don't have all of that, but I think they would be my top tips of where to start with.
Excellent. Thanks very much for that, Rachel. We're just about for time now, I guess. So let's just say thanks everyone for attending and for sort of taking time out of your busy schedules to listen. And thanks, Rachel, for your insight on the apprenticeships as well. And thanks very much, everyone. Cheers now.
Thank you.